All right, what's up, everybody? So somebody asked me yesterday if I could do a quick SAQ walkthrough video, just to do a last-minute reminder of how these should be approached. And so I flipped to the end of 4.7 in AMSCO, and here was an example SAQ that you can practice. And so I'm going to walk through this one and show you guys how I would do it. All right, so as usual, when I come to anything like this, so this SAQ has a stimulus. So first I would focus on the sourcing for it, the caption that tells you what it is. So this is something from Rutilio Martinez and Vish Iyer, Latin America's Racial Caste System, Salient Marketing Implications, 2008. So this is a secondary source, a history about racial caste in Latin America, and it was written fairly recently in 2008. So here we go. Nowadays, some 185 years after most of Latin American nations obtained their independence, none of the Latin American governments consider race to be an issue. All of these governments are firmly convinced that the racial caste system of colonial times has totally disappeared. This firmly held conviction is, however, not shared by academics and ordinary citizens who have noticed the distinct racial stratification of the Latin American societies. For these dissenters, the prevailing racial economic hierarchy and the easily uncovered attitudes that consider the dark-skinned unattractive and inferior clearly indicates that the racial caste system continues to operate. Today's racial caste system is, of course, not nearly as rigid as it was in colonial times, but the fact that it has survived 185 years of social, economic, and political advances implies that this system is deeply embedded in the Latin societies. Hence, it must have relevant social, economic, and political effects. Okay, so there is the stimulus. Okay, so now that I've read through the stimulus real quick, I go ahead and look at, of course, always these SAQs are three-part questions, A, B, and C. And so I look first at part A, and it says, explain the author's argument about in the passage about the racial caste system. Now that's a typo. I think it's supposed to say, explain the author's argument in the passage about the racial caste system. And so I'm going to show you how I would do that on the SAQ lined page. Our SAQ lined page will look something like this. And I want to go ahead and start by putting a label for part A in the area where I'm going to answer part A with a 2, 3, 4 sentence response. So here's my response to part A. In the passage, the author is making an argument that the government officials claim that the caste system is a thing of the past, but that in fact it is still an ongoing factor. They argue that by observing those in places of economic power and prestige, as well as social attitudes and beauty standards, one can still see remnants of the caste system, which was designed to put Spaniards and their descendants in positions of authority over indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. So that's a pretty short and concise response, but I feel like my first sentence definitely answers their question directly, as it's stated in the prompt. And my next sentence goes ahead and links that argument. It goes ahead and talks about how it is that there are things you can observe, specific examples in their society and economy that seem like they're tied to the old caste system. And I went ahead and described that a little bit just to link it historically to what I know historically about what the Spanish did in the New World. And so I feel like that is a concise and on-target answer with some specificity to it. Okay, so part B says, explain one way in which the caste system changed European economies in the period 1450 to 1750. All right, so for my answer for part B, I went with one way in which the caste system changed European economies in the period 1450 to 1750 CE was in creating a labor system which met rising European demand for cheap raw goods, especially sugar. The caste system put Spaniards in control of land worked by indigenous people or enslaved Africans, whose coerced labor produced cash crops meeting soaring demand from Europe's markets. So notice that my first sentence pretty much just steals the language from the prompt and flips it into an answer, which is the easiest way for me to stay on target. I just go ahead and identify that the change to Europe's economy from the Costa system was that they had plenty of access to raw goods produced in the Americas because of what the Costa system was meant to do, especially producing valuable things like sugar. And in my second sentence, I just dive a little deeper into that and talk about how the Costa system was really built so that Spaniards, either Peninsulares or Creoles, could control land and used coerced labor to produce really valued cash crops. And those ended up finding their way back across the Atlantic onto Europe's markets, where there was always going to be demand for those kinds of things. And it could be bought, of course, relatively cheaply because it was being produced back in the Americas by people who were not being paid, who were being coerced into labor. And so that's part of the Costa system. That's the connection I'm making. All right, and for part C here, explain one historical situation in the period 1450 to 1750 other than the one illustrated in the passage, in which imperial states adopted policies that limited the political power and influence of groups of people. So I got to think through this one, same time period, but another historical situation, not the one that was just mentioned, that imperial states adopted policies that limited the political power and influence of groups of people. And so for part C, I went with an historical situation from 1450 to 1750 in which an imperial state limited the political power and influence of a group of people was in Britain's mercantilist policy towards its North American colonists. In their system, the colonists of the 13 North American colonies were only seen as subjects to the empire and a source of revenue, and not given fair political representation in Britain's parliament, which would eventually lead to friction. So there are numerous examples that I could have gone with, but that's just the kind of first one that popped into my mind. Was the British obviously considering their colonists as people who were just really meant to make them richer, and not, of course, giving them the ability to shape their politics. That wasn't really their place. And so their power and influence was politically very limited. And eventually, of course, as you know, the colonists are not going to accept that role and are going to want to have a lot more autonomy and the ability to eventually shape their political destiny. And that leads to the American Revolution. But anyway, that's an example of that I thought of. And notice that in my first sentence, again, I steal language from the prompt. I just roll it right into an answer. And then in the second sentence, I just dive deeper into it and kind of show them what I mean with some specifics by letting them know I understand what the word mercantilism means. And so that should be good to go. All right, so when it all is said and done, this would be one of my 3 SAQs, and I've got my 3-part answer here, parts A, B, and C, and this is what your page would look like when you're done with one of your SAQs. And so I should be on my way to a decent SAQ section. Right now, I believe I've got my first 3 points all good. Now remember, if you didn't know how to respond to one of these, and one of them you just kind of write something but you're not super confident that it's good, it's okay to drop a point here and there on the SAQs. You definitely aren't expected to get 9 out of 9 points, but if you can get 5 or 6 or 7 points out of 9, that's awesome. So shoot for what you can and answer it the best you can in the time that you're given. And but this is the way I approach it. This is the way that I think you can do a SAQ and shoot for success on the AP exam.